Welcome to the podcast Scattered, one person's search for the story behind scattered remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I speak about searching for and the discovery and recovery of dispersed remains from outdoor contexts. I offer new perspectives and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with valuable information on a subject that isn't talked about, doesn't seem to be a priority, and that is very understudied. I hope you enjoy.
Dave, why don't we start with you? Just tell me who you are and what you do.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for talking to us as well. I'm David Errickson, or Dr. David Errickson, as Cranfield will describe me, I suppose. And I'm a senior lecturer in forensic archaeology and anthropology at Cranfield University, but also the course director for forensic archaeology and anthropology as well. And I guess I kind of wear two hats, which is quite rare in the UK, I think, for somebody who's working both disciplines. You're either an archaeologist or an anthropologist, I feel. But my background is, although primarily in archaeology, I worked in commercial archaeology for many years with a number of different kind of UK contracting companies, as well as my undergraduate was in archaeology, a Bachelor of Science at Bradford. My master's was in forensic archaeology and crime scene investigation. It was really kind of like the anthropological side of things which kind of interested me. And so for my PhD, I moved more into that kind of forensic anthropological realm. So doing a little bit of forensic anthropology. And most of my research kind of focuses on, in the archaeological world, the recovery of conflict casualties and the search and kind of exhumation process, specifically at the moment, the Second World War. That's kind of a lot of work that we're doing at Cranfield underneath the banner of Cranfield's Recovery and Identification of Conflict Casualties team, so the CRICC team. And then in an anthropological setting, I'm really interested in scavenging and how scavengers can disrupt a crime scene and trying to work out basically what these little critters have done in some instances. And I can tell you in a little while a few stories about where I've got into trouble as well through scavenging. But yeah, I guess that's me really in a nutshell.
All right. Well, that kind of leads us then into Lara. Lara, say your name and where you are right now.
Yes, I'm Lara Indra, and I am working as an anthropologist in the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Bern in Switzerland. And I'm also doing my PhD here in forensic anthropology and in particular in forensic taphonomy, where I'm, as Dave, passionate about the topic of scavenging and animal-induced scattering of human remains in a forensic context. And that's kind of our favorite topic.
And Dave was your supervisor.
Exactly, during my master, and he brought me on to the topic of scavenging in the first place. So thank you, Dave.
You've completely corrupted her now, Dave.
Apparently so. But I feel like this is now becoming very much the case of the master becoming the student. Lara is very fast becoming the expert in kind of animal scavenging, I would say.
Nice. Well done. All right. Well, do you know what? Let's just start with the paper that I ran across, and we'll start there and we'll branch out from there. So the paper that I'm referring to is Uncovering Forensic Taphonomic Agents, Animal Scavenging in the European Context. And Lara, you're first author on this with Dave, and then Alexandria Young, who we had from a separate podcast, is third author, and also Sandra, who I don't know, is fourth author. So this not only is scavenging in a forensic and even archaeological context a small untapped research area, but in a European context, it seems to be even smaller. Tell me how this idea, I don't know, did it start with you, Dave, this idea of doing some research, or Lara, did it start with you?
I think to kind of put this into context a little bit, the forensic taphonomic world, the research in forensic taphonomy, is becoming. In the past, it's been there, but a lot of the methods that we're using today, or a lot of the research that we're kind of building our current research on, is a little bit outdated, I would say. I might get shot for saying that, but I feel like we're still using textbooks from the 80s and the 90s, which are super outdated, considering there's a lot has happened in 20, 25 years. Even things like climate change, for example, is hugely impacting kind of our methods and the accuracy of these methods. And so I think that people should start to look at taphonomy in the 21st century, really, and coming up with new ways of kind of either studying it. And DevInfinity at Kent is doing some really interesting work on kind of automation and machine learning and such. And I guess really in one of the lectures at Cranfield, I talk about scavenging and forensic taphonomy and how some of these issues that we kind of had. And then Lara wanted to kind of look into this, look into like the scavenging species in the UK to begin with, and then branch out onto scavenging species in Europe. And I guess that's really exactly what you did, Lara.
Yes, I do think so. So the project actually, well, the paper resulted from my master's thesis, where Dave was my supervisor, and the project was supposed to be an experiment on scavenging, but then due to the pandemic couldn't take place. And I'm in some ways happy about that, because the paper is quite nice and it taught me a lot. And well, especially now that I do forensic anthropological casework and see the scavenging impact on the cases, I found that the literature also is about North American aspects mainly, and we are missing animal species that live in Europe. So this was a very good opportunity to gather all the information on animals that live in Europe, which has not been done in this size before. So yeah, I think it filled kind of a gap that was there.
Nice. Yes, because I recently discovered that a book that was put out. Oh, I forget her name. I think it was somebody out of Texas or somewhere down in the southern U.S. Kind of doing the same thing with North American scavengers. And
Yes, Sinsabox and Stikangi,
yes,
I think.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, again, very much needed because there is a gap. Well, at least there was. And to compile all that information into a written resource. Thank you. So what are you doing now, Lara?
Currently, I'm doing or have been doing an experiment last year where I'm writing up the data right now, where we put out domestic pig cadavers in a forest in Switzerland to observe them with cameras to see the animal activity at and around the carcasses, and to see which animals come and which part of the body are they interested in, what kinds of traces do they leave, and do they take any bones or body parts with them, and where do they take them, just to get some baseline knowledge on animal activity at remains, human or animal, in this area of Europe.
Very cool. So it sounds like you're doing pretty much exactly the same thing as what Sherry Forbes is doing here in Canada. The study that I'm helping her with, because that's what we're looking at, is what scavengers are feeding on pig carcasses. We're using them as human analogs, and just to find out who's doing what's going on.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that this kind of research is ongoing in other parts as well. It's always when you hear it about it's in the publications thereafter, but not during.
Right. Yeah. It's very nice to be to know about it during, because then you can compare notes and find out what's going on.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have in forensic taphonomy right now, is that we've got all of these individual clusters of absolutely amazing research. Shari's research in Canada is wonderful, and her research previously in Australia was amazing too. And we've got people up in Sweden, people in South Africa, doing these really, really interesting kind of experimental work, which we really need. But we need to start talking to each other a little more in the discipline, so that we can start to compare results and compare data, so that we
just
can
a little more, Dave. Just a little more.
Yeah, well, probably a lot more. So yeah, because what would in an ideal world, what would be really good is that we all do the same experiment at the same time at different taphonomy facilities across the world.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah, direct comparison.
Yeah.
Maybe
especially considering your comment about climate change. If as you say, that is producing some sort of effect that we need to be aware of now versus 40 years ago, then we should be doing those simultaneous studies.
Absolutely, and also the baseline studies. As you both rightly noted, the baseline study is so important. Because at the moment, a lot of the taphonomy facilities in the past, they built a facility, they put human remains out, and then they studied them, which is great. We have data then what we haven't had before. But you're not being able to compare that data to what the site was like beforehand. So you don't know what the difference is, what the norm was, and what the abnormal is. And now we find with the newer taphonomy facilities that are being set up, that people are going out for a year at least before even a carcass is put out, to look at the soil microbial activities, to look at the rainfall and the temperature and the soil moisture content, the pH levels, because then when we do put a body out, we've got something then to be able to look at what changes. And really, that's kind of the most important thing, I think, is knowing what changes and how that impacts the environment that we're working in.
I didn't get a whole lot of sense from previous studies that they were actually capturing that data, like you say, soil pH and microbial data and whatever. That just wasn't even on their radar.
Yeah, I don't think it was, but I think that's because there was much more of a focus in the past on the body rather than the other factors that surround the body or in fact affect the environment itself. It's been more about watching a body decompose and seeing how that body decomposes, rather than rainfall affecting that body or the soil affecting that body. And I think we've really seen a huge shift, which is great, in looking at the other factors and taking those individual factors and breaking them down as well, and looking at how they can really kind of change the decomposition process.
Right. And scavenging is a whole other layer, because, like at Sherry's facility, those taphonomic facilities are enclosed. They are excluding scavengers from the studies because they're focusing on decomp. So, scavengers, that's kind of another variable that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Lara will probably say a little bit more on this than me, but in the past, we've had bodies in cages, and then people are publishing works that say, well, this is how the body decomposed. But if you start to limit the variables of a real crime scene, and how accurate really is your data? Now, I do understand that we do have to take individual elements and have to break them down and observe them independently of one another. But scavenging is a huge kind of change in that kind of decomposition process when it happens, that we can't really neglect it as much as what we have done in the past.
Right, especially when we've got remains in an outdoor context, because very often those remains are just open, not only to, the elements, but all of nature, which includes animals, whether they're their scavengers or not.
Yeah, that with the open context, we see that a lot in Switzerland. We do have some mountains, and as the glaciers are melting, there is more and more remains that come alight, and also hikers and mountaineers that have accidents in the mountains that cannot be found for months or even years. So when we recover them, it's basically almost never the entire skeleton, because it's scattered around, not only due to geographical features, but also due to scavenging, because most of the remains from there are scavenged and transported away. And sometimes we recover a person several times and we only find out that it's the same person due to DNA. But with the scavenging traces, we can see that animals have been involved, also because it was not in the falling line, for example. So it's in a wider context, especially important to not only have these experiments or case studies without cages, but also to compare caged individuals with non-caged ones. And that's what we did in my PhD experiment, where also Dave is a supervisor, to compare caged and non-caged animals, also to possibly make some new opinions on whether it makes sense to cage them or whether we shouldn't do that at all.
Oh, okay. So I'm just gonna to back up a minute just to make sure that I'm on the same track as you. So previous studies have looking at scavenger activity on remains have used caged animals, where pretty much the remains are just kind of, I don't know, fed to them, for lack of a better way of saying it, and so there's been some discussion about whether or not the behavior of the caged animal is at all similar and representative of uncaged or wild animals. Is that correct?
I'm more talking about the carcasses being caged or not.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so protecting them from scavenging, stopping the
Yes.
scavenging from occurring, like
Okay.
putting them physically in a cage in a taphonomy facility to stop foxes from getting to them and such.
Oh, all right. So then, I'm sorry, I'm really not following then. So if you're keeping from scavengers from, if the caged carcasses are keeping the scavengers from them, then are you expecting scavengers to like find their way in, or?
No, so this is the problem: is that experiments in the past, not all experiments, but many experiments in the past, put their animals in cages to stop the scavengers from getting in, so they could observe the decomposition process.
Right.
But we are arguing that you probably should for certain aspects, but if you want to do a complete study of decomposition with all of the variables, that you need to leave that carcass exposed to scavenging.
Ah, right. Yes. Okay. Yes, and I full-heartedly agree, because when you've got case calls, like you said, Laura, people that hikers or whoever go out into the mountains and then they die for whatever reason out there, they're not going to be in cages.
No, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Yes, usually not.
We hope not. Let's put it that way. That's a whole other ballgame if they are.
Yeah, so that's why we had in the experiment caged pig cadavers and uncaged ones, so that we could
Alright.
compare the decomposition process between these two modalities.
All right. So you're really getting it to the heart of some of these research methods, which is good, because there's a lot that was, I don't know, either taken for granted or overlooked, I think, in the past. And so I can understand your comment, Dave, about the previous studies being outdated, and we need to not just broaden the research foundation, but also, look at them a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think for what we needed at the time, we were getting the results that we needed for whatever experiments we were running. But I think the questions are now changing so much that we have to develop new ways of looking at science, and science evolves, technology evolves, other equipment becomes available to do these kind of studies. So I don't think it's a fault of anybody in particular or anything like that. I think it's just that now there are better ways of doing things, and we should be implementing those methods.
Right. And yeah, I think you're right. That's just the nature of science. It's what happens. It evolves, it grows. We find new ways of looking at things and new ways of doing things.
Yeah, my PhD student supervisor, my PhD supervisor once said to me, "Science never sleeps," and I always I always remember that.
All right. Before we move on, I'd just like to ask Lara a couple of questions about the case calls that she works on at a very high level. So you mentioned, doing some work in the mountains and looking for, whether remains have been found or what have you. What are you asked to do when you are being called?
The main thing is always identification. Who is this person? And also they want to know what might have happened. And that's first question is usually easy to answer because the police forces have always, or most of the time, a pretty good idea who is missing in the mountains. So they have comparison samples of DNA, for example, and then we just take samples and we can identify the person or the remains. And the second question, what might have happened, or is usually more difficult to answer because we have a lot of geological processes going on up there with melting and freezing and let's say all these stone pebbles falling down. And so we cannot really distinguish, for example, between this person has fell during lifetime and died due to that, or the person has been overrun by, let's say, stones. So this question is more difficult to answer. And then sometimes there is a question of where is the rest of the body. And when there is geological processes involved, it's easier to find out because then you just have to follow the fault line. But when there is animal activity, it's more difficult. And there you need to know more about the behavior of the animals that are up there. You have to know the fauna that is there and to know which of these animals might be interested in scavenging these remains. And there is just not a lot of knowledge around. So also this work is difficult to conduct.
So do you go out into the field to where the remains are, or are you working mostly in the lab with what is given to you?
It's mainly lab work, especially when it comes from the mountains, because it's difficult to go there. But it can happen, and it has happened, that I'm called to the site itself and that I can see where the remains are and start looking for them.
So it sounds like you really rely a lot on the police or the searchers or whoever's searching for and recovering the remains on their information of what the environment is like and what they've seen at the scene. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's how it is here in our institute. And then there comes the aspect of the mountains. It's not easy to get there. Sometimes you have to go by helicopter and you have to have a certain education of mountain climbing and security aspects. And then just not non-experienced people cannot go up there due to safety risks.
And so because you're relying so much on, I guess, third-party information, I'm just wondering about, your interpretation of, because you said that you are often asked not just for the identification of the individual, but also what happened. to the individual, how much, I guess, the contextual information that you're given factors into, I guess, your overall narrative of what may have happened to this person.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. There is a lot of information missing if you don't see the context itself, and if you only see it on pictures or from hearsaying. But the police is doing a very good job in documenting everything. We have the coordinates, we have sometimes 3D models of the area, and all of these aspects. So that's a great help. But of course, it's not as good as if you would be there yourself and could see everything.
3D models, that's cool.
Yes.
I'm envious. That's awesome. Yeah, I just find that sometimes, yeah, you're right. Being out at the scene, and there's so much, I guess, information that you gather yourself that you don't even realize that you're gathering that is
Yes.
important to what you need to do. And trying to, I guess, translate that into a request, if you're just in the lab, is difficult. But then also training somebody else to look for that information for you
Hmm.
can also be difficult.
Yes, true.
Yeah, I don't know what to do about that. I guess, maybe that's, part of doing all this research and, publishing it and getting it out there is just increasing the awareness and accessibility of this information so people can start to know what to look for.
Yes, exactly. And often it's just that they are not aware of the potential that these information can have. And once you talk to them and explain a bit what you are doing with the work and everything and research, then they are very interested and eager to learn and also apply these things.
So I'm gonna skip back to Dave and the recovery stuff that you do.
I just one last point about the scavenging before,
Sure.
we moved on to that. I originally got into scavenging through reading animal bite marks and scavenging patterns in the literature. And one of the research projects I've been currently undertaking is I've got a lot of collaborations with zoos in the UK, Longleat Safari, Flamingo Land, Colchester Zoo, the Zoological Society of London, just to name a few. And they keep the bone samples which have been chewed on by various animals for me. And so I look at kind of like the teeth pattern and the scavenging patterns that are left on the remains. And I literally have a freezer at work full of horse bones that have been chewed on by lions and bears and,
Nice.
and various other animals. And I think that's really kind of how I first started out in terms of my research. But the conflict casualties stuff. So my interest lies in archaeology, in the recovery of human remains in a historical conflict setting. And Cranfield has a group called the Cranfield Recovery and Identification of Conflict Casualties. It's CRICC for short. And they basically go out in partnership with the DPAA, so the Defense Prisoner of War Missing in Action Accounting Agency, amongst other groups as well. But the DPAA is one of our main partners in this kind of work. And the DPAA basically sits underneath the Department of Defense in the United States. And in Congress many years ago, they decided that they were going to bring back every single one of their dead from conflict zones, including the First and Second World War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, and rebury them, identify them, and rebury them in Arlington Cemetery or the Punch Bowl or such, these military cemetery sites. And the United States set a budget to do this and a number of identifications per year to try and achieve. And I believe that number sits somewhere around 200 at the moment a year. But I could be mistaken a little bit there. And basically, the DPAA have their own in-house archaeologists and teams that go out with the military to recover these war dead individuals. So these are from ground lost troops, or there may be individuals that were in aeroplanes that were shot down in these wars. And they focus a lot in the Pacific at the moment, but obviously there was 2 theaters in the Second World War, for instance, in Europe as well. And so they partner with a number of institutions, CRICC being one of them. And so we go out and basically do that recovery work for the DPAA to hopefully find and repatriate the remains of their soldiers and other people's, family members and loved ones back to the United States for identification. And then a proper full military honors reburial, which is always kind of heartwarming.
So this is for the U.S. repatriation, correct?
So this stuff is
Okay.
The Second World War stuff we do, but we also Nicholas Marquez Grant, one of my colleagues, he works on Spanish Civil War recovery, for example.
All right.
And then I have another colleague called Peter Campbell, who's doing a lot of underwater recovery from conflicts, in particular Second World War at the moment. And then Roland Westling is kind of the fourth in our group. He basically has all of the experience from recovery of mass graves, and he's excavated sites such as Rwanda and Syria, I believe. Oh, maybe Syria, or the Middle East, not Syria. So kind of our experience has been built up between ourselves over the past 10 years for and beyond for Roland, more so recently for myself, and now most of what we do we apply to the Second World War or the events of the last kind of 100 years, I would say.
And so what are the policies for UK repatriation, or are there policies on UK repatriation?
Yeah, so we're mostly protected by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So the UK and the US have 2 very different kind of ideologies or opinions on the war dead. So the UK believes that where your body kind of fell is basically your last resting place, or the cemetery, the local cemetery that it was moved to is basically your last resting place. And a lot of war graves are protected by legislation, so it would be illegal without the right permissions in place to go and excavate a soldier that died from the United Kingdom or the British Empire, as such.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to set up that contrast because Canada is much like UK, being a Commonwealth country. So we have very similar policies. And actually, I was just in Ottawa last week, and I was talking to our casualty identification coordinator and her work going to other countries, particularly France, to help identify Canadian fallen and what have you. But it sounds like the work that you do within your unit at Cranfield, that you're doing a lot of, outreach, helping other countries with their fallen soldiers.
Yeah, Roland was part of the Fromelles excavation. There was British soldiers involved there, but also a lot of Australian soldiers.
Right.
Australia have a very active kind of community in Europe recovering their war dead, which is quite interesting. I would say that I guess a lot of work that we do at the moment is centered around other countries, but for me, it is about the country a little bit, but it's more about the humanitarian aspect. It's more about sending someone back home to their family or their loved one, and I believe that everybody within CRICC would kind of identify with this kind of morale or moral obligation, I suppose, in that we're doing service to somebody's loved one, trying to identify them and then repatriate them and rebury them back in an area that the family wants. The fact that a lot of the American kind of families that are involved have relatives who were in the Second World War that died, whether it's like a great uncle that's still alive today or what have you. they're the ones that want their loved ones back, or they're the ones that want that kind of closure. And it's just nice to be able to bring that to them. And Nick's work in the Spanish Civil War recovery is really interesting, because a lot of the time the families are actually sat around the graves when they're excavating the graves.
Oh, wow.
And there is that kind of very much social contact with the people who are who you're kind of recovering, as well as the people who are still alive today, which is it's quite an emotional thing, really. Yeah.
Closure's a big thing, and I think we have a tendency, and I don't know if this is a cultural thing, but I think we have a tendency to, I don't know, maybe underplay it. Or...
Yeah, I think I don't. Since 9/11, I think things are starting to shift, because a lot of focus on kind of welfare and well-being was placed upon those who were involved in the incident. But I think we're now starting to understand that actually the people who are recovering are the first responders who might be assisting the scene to begin with. There's more kind of now emphasis for them to also be helped emotionally, after an incident that happened or such. And I think we're starting to kind of understand a lot more about the need to reach out for help, and the methods that are available, the people, the opportunities that are available to talk to people. And it's nice to see that shift, but I think it is quite a new thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I should add here, actually, Lara also recovers as a part of the VDK, right, Lara?
Not of the VDK, it's a separate organization, but yes, we do recoveries or searches for and recoveries of Second World War soldiers, mainly in Germany. And it's a big organization with only volunteers in it, so it's very nice to see that people are eager to help in their holidays, actually, and how eager they are to do it on a scientific level as well. And it's very nice to see that volunteers with no background in archaeology or anthropology or anything like it can do such a wonderful work with proper documentation and with success as well. We do identify people, and I've now started to finally implement DNA in our work as well to validate some of the results we've achieved.
Very cool. So you said that the volunteers are very willing and able to, I guess, use the methods, archaeological methods and recovery methods with success.
Yes.
And
yes.
yeah, sometimes I just, being a former archaeologist too, sometimes, I look at our methods and it's like, writing a novel on, this little, I don't know, piece of bone or, stone tool that you found, the level of depth that sometimes we require ourselves to go through in our scientific processes. and to think that a volunteer would be up to the challenge and willing to do that, that's pretty amazing.
Well, you do have to have compromises, of course, and they did this for a long time and only slowly implemented more scientific methods. But in order to get permission to work somewhere, they have to bring a proper documentation as well. So without it, it wouldn't even be possible, which is probably also a driver for them to do this. But with compromises, and given that it's volunteers, it's a very good work.
I think no matter whether you're an academic or a professional or a volunteer, the idea behind going out and recovering somebody's loved one and sending them back home is shared between those individuals. It is very much a personal thing to do and undertake, and I think it's a nice thing, really, without kind of like putting too much kind of sugar in it, I suppose, like that. It's something that is a good thing to do, and it's a valuable thing to do, to be able to kind of take part in this. And I think those who I've been involved with, and Lara would hopefully agree, is that everybody wants to help and will do their absolute best to do the work to the best of their ability, because they know at the end of the day we might actually find somebody's loved one and might be able to return them back home.
Those people that I talk to that do this, either as an academic, professionally, volunteer, whatever, that's the underlying reason. It's that they want to contribute to the closure.
Yeah, the story. Yeah, the end of the story, I suppose.
Yeah.
And what's quite nice is we're heading out to Sicily on Saturday to undertake another recovery deployment as a partnership with the DPAA. And then we also have another one lined up for later on this year. We just finished one. So it's quite an active community. This is just CRICC here, but there are a number of other organizations across Europe who are also actively doing this. And if you take the Second World War alone, there are about 72,000 individuals that are missing currently, and about 40,000 of those are deemed recoverable. So it's a mammoth task, really.
Yeah, it's mind blowing.
And unfortunately, I don't want to put a downer on anything. I know we're talking about forensic science, but we're doing right now Second World War. We're talking about the Second World War and the conflicts around that, but we just need to cast our mind across to what's happening in Ukraine right now. I know that the International Committee for the Red Cross are out there at the moment doing some work behind the scenes, but you see in the news, in the articles in the newspapers, hundreds and thousands of people currently being lined in mass graves, ready for recovery later on for identification. And unfortunately, again, some companies, some groups, some volunteer organizations and such are going to be going out there and doing the same thing there. So, when I say unfortunately, it's just in terms of an emotional kind of feeling. Like, obviously, fortunately, that somebody's actually able to go out there and identify, but it's not exactly the nicest kind of context to be working in at times.
No, it's very present too. I mean, the conflict is still going on. So when you go out to help on a recovery effort, like let's say one of these World War II recovery efforts, what is your involvement? Either Dave or Laura, if you want to answer this, like, are you there to help identify? Are you there to help, have remains already been found and you're helping to recover them? What's your involvement?
So from my perspective, I'm there to find and to search. My aim is twofold, or maybe threefold, to either find an area or find the site where the plane might have gone down, to correlate the plane with the incident itself using material from the plane. It might be a radio call plate with a number on it. It might be a Browning machine gun with an asset number on it, which is affiliated to the plane. Or it might even just be parts of a plane that is a B-17 and not an A-20 Havoc or a Spitfire as such. And then thirdly, to identify where in that kind of incident, the crash site, the archaeology site itself, where remains might be, to recover them for sending back to the laboratory. We don't do any ID work for the DPAA. That's all done in forensically accredited labs back in Hawaii. So for me, I'm very much in charge, leading the recovery and deciding the methods used on site, the excavation process, where exactly we dig, looking at the evidence that we recover and following that evidence. Whereas Lara, I think probably a little different. She's more of a specialist, I'd say.
I come in a little bit later, usually in the process. So all the research where the casualties have happened, they are done by a historian and by, let's say, the top level of our organization. And I'm more in charge of the anthropological part. So I'm leading the anthropology, doing everything with the bones, with the skeletal remains of the soldiers. that we recover. So directly in the field, so that they can go to be reburied very soon after they are recovered. My main task is to document everything that we find, to document the skeletal remains, to document little features, especially in the teeth, but also like healed fractures, for example, or any particular skeletal characteristics that might help with identification later on. Usually we don't have any antemortem records apart from photographs of the people. We know who was in this field where we mainly work. It's in Eastern Germany. So we know from records and historic research who was there. So sometimes we can identify people through that. And a further task that I do is sampling for DNA and then prepare the samples. And it's all about identification, but also about recording the trauma that has happened to these people, to maybe see what could have led to their death, or gather information to gain more knowledge about what has happened on that battlefield and compare it to the written sources that we have.
Yeah, two very different, I guess, roles in recovery of remains.
Normally on a site like I would work on, there'll be a number of individuals with specialist roles. You might have a linguist, for example, who can speak the local language. I certainly can't speak Italian. My German is a little rusty. We might have somebody who's an expert in life support equipment or plane parts, so they can help you identify exactly where on the plane what you're looking at, which is really important if you're looking for a bomber versus a fighter jet, for example. The crew will probably in a bomber be in the cargo hold or scattered across the plane, whereas you're looking for a cockpit for a fighter, for example. So looking at pieces of information, pieces of metal that might have come from the cockpit is obviously really important, because that's probably where the remains are going to be located. We might have an individual who's competent with UXO, unexploded ordnance, because some of these planes went down with full payloads on board. And obviously, if we're excavating, we need to be able to recognize these hazards and dangers that we might come across. So they're very much multidisciplinary, multinational teams that we work with, and it's always a lot of fun meeting people on these excavations. And then, of course, you've got the specialists like Lara, the forensic anthropologist, the osteoarchaeologists, and so on, who are really, really kind of key to that identification process, either on site or later on in the laboratories.
So how do they figure out? So are you there to figure out where to dig, or are you do you have an idea? Like, I'm just thinking logistically, they probably wouldn't have you over there if you're just going to be, I guess, walking a field and doing test pits, and you have the foggiest idea if it's there or not. Like, there's probably some sort of, I don't know, town records or historical information, witness accounts that, hey, a plane, we've got 10 people saying that a plane went down over in this field.
Absolutely.
And
so there's always the DPAA have their own historical research teams that have already done the research on where a plane might potentially be. There are German shoot down records, for example, which are held within some church parishes or local kind of communities. Witnesses, of course, which for the First World War obviously is pretty difficult now, but there is some written documentation from witnesses that have been interviewed in the past. There's a whole host of information that they kind of delve into, archival records and such, which kind of point to an area where that plane might be. And then between the historical research and actually going and excavating, there is a phase where a team will go out and do a survey, undertake a survey, may do a little bit of geophysics or metal detecting to try and find, essentially what we're looking for is a large ball of metal that hit the ground. Do we have a large anomaly of metal signatures in a particular field that we might be able to correlate to an incident or such? So it is a lengthy process, and some of these sites might take years to excavate, depending on the size of them. If you imagine a B-17 blowing up, for example, with a full payload on board in an open field, the debris field alone is going to be large, but also you've got 75 years of ploughing in some instances where that plane is going to be pulled across a field by farming apparatus and such. So there are a lot of variables over 75 years that can distort scenes and distort sites that kind of have to be taken into consideration as well.
So when you go over after all this work has been done and you're essentially digging in somebody's field, what kind of responses have you had from the neighborhood?
Always great.
Okay.
Always great. The landowners are always very much willing, very much supportive of the projects. Always happy to help. We've had hotels in the past that have supplied us with food on particularly cold days, which has been really nice. And they've come out to the site with chili, for example, for us so we can warm up. We've had people who are just willing to kind of source materials for us if we need them, if we need extra lumber for building things, or we need a mechanical excavator to quickly remove some soil or something that might have happened. So I've never really had a bad experience on these recoveries. It's always been from the volunteers to the experts to the locals. It's always been challenging, but it's always been a nice atmosphere to work in.
And Lara,
it's just the same with us. The response from the people that live in the area where we dig is just beautiful. They are very interested. They come to the fields as often as they can, not only to help, but also the same as Dave said, to provide us with food and cake and everything. And that's so nice to see. And also our organization is entirely funded by donations from people like those, and also from people that, they live in the area. They are very interested in the history of the area as well, interested in any kind of research that helps to verify what happened there. And that's just very nice to see. We also had people, eyewitnesses that have been part of the war, that came to us to the field and to work with us, and they told us stories. And that's always also a big gathering, a society gathering somehow. I don't know how I could express that, but it's a very nice weeks. It's very nice weeks every year.
That's so lovely to hear. Well, I'm very conscious of your time, and I desperately want to talk to you about site mapping and the experience in commercial archaeology and all that kind of stuff. But it's getting late where you are, so I'm going to open this up. And Lara, you said you had burning questions. You still have burning questions?
I do, actually.
All right.
Yes. So I would be very interested in hearing more about what you do. Where are you affiliated, and what kind of projects are you doing on which topics?
Where am I affiliated? I'm affiliated with the Yvonne Business School of Doing Business by Herself. I'm an independent researcher, mostly because I have found it very difficult to find somebody in Canada to supervise a PhD project. I've tried a couple of times, and my efforts to get into a PhD program have failed. And then it came down to, well, do I really need to be officially affiliated with an academic institution to do my research? And I came to the conclusion, no. So I was just starting to get up and running, looking for my own site, when Sherry Forbes kind of popped out of the blue and started up this current research project. And she was looking for anthropologists across the country so that she could expand and do the scavenger project across Canada. And so, yeah, I was contacted and I said, yeah. So she's the academic kind of anchor of the project, and I'm kind of just, volunteered, hired help.
So your background is in anthropology?
So I don't know what it's like in Europe, but in Canada, we follow the 4-field approach. So there's anthropology, and then within that, there's the subdisciplines of physical anthropology, archaeology, cultural anthropology, and linguistics. And so I have undergrad in archaeology with a specialization in physical anthropology, and I also have an anthropology undergrad degree. My master's is in anthropology, even though I did more of a forensic taphonomy type research project.
Okay.
So it's not really cut and dry. My foundation is very broad, and I was also I did commercial archaeology for a good 6 years or so. Well,
Okay.
a lot more than that, but, full-time 6 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really
So-
interesting. I'd love to know more about. So the commercial archaeology aspect, were you working on basically like pipelines, that type of stuff, or?
Yeah, in Alberta, and I think a lot of Canada, but Alberta especially, there is legislation that states for specifically any oil and gas development, they have to do some sort of historical resource assessment. There are other developments that obviously are not included in that, like, you want to build a golf course, you want to build residential, what have you. So they're not obligated to, but a lot of times out of due diligence, they will. As well, because of First Nations here, in order to maintain relationships, there are oil and gas companies and other companies that will hire archaeology companies and do an historical resources assessment to help with that relationship with the First Nations. Because pretty much all of our everything archaeological in Canada is First Nations. So the types of sites that we look for are quite different.
But still, yeah, understanding context is important. Yeah, no matter what the site is. And yeah, I think that's something that we all do, right?
Absolutely, yes. Context is everything.
Oh, thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.